Evening everybody, Silverbolt here, back for the second video in my horror genre stories, what have you. Now for this video I'm going to be focusing, as I said in the last one, on the 40s, 50s. I'll probably stop with the 40s and the 50s because the 60s and the 70s became quite intertwined. The 80s then had their own set of classics, but of course the 80s also saw the rise of the video nasty scare, and then of course you had the 90s and the noughties. The 90s and noughties, in all fairness, probably won't take that long. So there we go. One thing I want to mention though, and I really should have mentioned this in the last version, was the 1930s really saw an up-and-coming rise in the market. In 1933 we had King Kong, and as I said in the last video, far outsurpassed Peter Jackson's multi-huge million, billion, squillion, dillion dollar expensive remake, even if Jack Black was in it, which is always a plus. However, one film that I did mean to mention that I never did was the 1932 film Freaks. Now, the film Freaks is something that you will never see again, at least not for a long time, at least not while the politically correct human rights brigade are around everywhere, because the film Freaks was called Freaks, well, obviously, but it also contained real life freaks, as in sideshow freaks. Now, not the comedic versions that we're used to seeing today. These were real, malformed, physically deformed people and mentally deformed people who were kept in cages, and some of them made quite good money. They knew that what they were. The only work they could find, I mean, the freak shows of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s were very much a byproduct of human disgust and arrogance in people less fortunate themselves. So when the director of Freaks came along, Browning, and he made this film, and when he made it, it was way ahead of his time. Way ahead of his time. You know, it was I can't even think of a film that would come close to Freaks. And Todd Browning made this film, and it was absolutely creepy as hell. And the storyline was how the freaks, after being treated nastily by a trapeze artist, by a brutal trapeze artist in this circus, they come up with a plan to make her into one of them, and they turn her into a half human, half bird-like creature. And it had really, really powerful, emotive responses, to the point where it was actually banned in the UK for 30 years. People didn't like it. You know, it was a horror film that people refused to watch, and it was given, and it had the kind of reactions that we wouldn't see again for 50 years until The Exorcist came out, because it was one of those films that forced people to have a look at who they were. You know, there was no prosthetics involved. There was no makeup. You know, these were real live mentally deformed people that people paid money to point and stare at. And then these freaks took their revenge, and people didn't like that idea. They didn't like it, and they refused to watch it. And it nearly killed Browning's career. Well, it pretty much did kill Browning's career. I mean, the man as a filmmaker, Todd Browning, was a visionary, and Freaks is the way that you see that. And people, and as I said, people didn't like it because he forced them to look at themselves. Humanity's greatest. If you want to judge a country, don't look at what its leaders do. Look at how it judges the least fortunate in society. That's one of the ways you can judge how a country operates. We don't work like that in this day and age. Well, that could be argued, but that's another subject entirely. I'm coming up with a lot of off-branch subjects in these videos. Okay, now then. That's what I've said on the 1930s. Now, as I said, I wanted to move up into the 1940s, and the late 30s and the 40s. And that is where we started to see the opening signs of films such as zombies. Zombies, of course, have been a classic, and admittedly, you know, zombies have have, for a long time, zombies pretty much had the same ideology. From the 30s up until the 70s, even the 80s, zombies pretty much just walked around going, brains, brains, and they didn't really do an awful lot else. It wasn't pretty much until, well, it wasn't more well known until George A. Romero completely redesigned the zombie horror genre by releasing, it was Day of the Dead, wasn't it? Where the zombies were all super hyped up loonies. It was Day of the Dead, wasn't it? Nice to know I'm being listened to here. It was Day of the Dead, wasn't it? Dawn of the Dead.
I just found out a new film called The Host, which is Stephanie Meyer's new one with Jensen Ackles in it.
I'm talking about decent stuff here. Anyway.
I won't be watching this.
Yes, you will. It's got Jensen Ackles in it.
Yeah, but ugh. The Host. Ew.
Anyway, completely off the topic. Yes, zombie films. So I'm going to go with Dawn of the Dead. Until George A. Romero, where the zombies became super hyperactive freaks. Zombies films, the only way they could win was sheer force of numbers, and they started coming about. And for a while, they weren't that scary. I mean, the very first true zombie film would have been made in 1932, and it would have been White Zombie. However, this film had Bela Lugosi in it. Now, Bela Lugosi has always been more famous for playing his roles of Dracula. And basically, he's an evil voodoo priest, he's a necromancer, he's a black wizard kind of job. And the film was done in a slightly different way, in that we don't see it very often anymore. It was minimal dialogue, and a lot of it was done with atmosphere. It was filmed to be visually atmospheric and very expressionistic, and instead of it being out in your face, it was a lot more subtle. I mean, a lot of it has to go down to Lugosi's ability to act, because the man was an absolutely fabulous actor. Zombies, however, have always had the short end of the stick, in that very often they are relegated to cheap slasher movies, and because zombies are easy to make. You put a little bit of makeup on somebody, a little bit of red eye makeup, maybe blacken their teeth a little bit, put them in ripped up clothes, and make them walk around really slowly with a vacant expression on their face. It's not hard. I do it every day when I'm at work. Sit there and make a computer like this. Anyway, so there we go. It's not exactly hard to make a zombie film. So they ended up getting really bad films with things like I Walk with a Zombie. That was based very loosely on a Jane Eyre novel. But they were terrible. And they almost all automatically flopped on sight. But of course they kept churning them out. These zombie films, and you had zombies in swamps and zombies in forests and zombies in fields, and it was ridiculous. But despite the fact that almost universally these zombie films flopped, they kept churning them out. They didn't stop. For about the next 30 years, zombie films just kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming, and it just got ridiculous by part of it. However, moving on, now the 1950s saw the rise of American B movies. Now, okay, I'm suddenly very popular. Now, American B movies were still, a lot of them were done in black and white, and now they've got an almost mythic status with them. You've got films. Heartily apologise, I'm back. Picking up straight away where we left off. You have films that came out in the American B movies in the 1950s, such as I Was a Teenage Werewolf, The Blob, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Crawling Eye, The Mummy was another one. Films like that. And they had their own little revolution in the 1950s, and they tended to be low budget that appealed to teenagers. And a lot of the horror genre throughout history has always appealed to more teenage audiences than it has to adult audiences. They weren't designed for 50-year-olds to go to the cinema to be scared. Now in the UK, in the 50s and 60s, we had another revival, and the UK had seen for about the last 30 years that people liked horror films, that people went and see horror films. So we had what had become known as the Hammer horrors, and they were developed by the UK Hammer Studios. And as they'd done with the Frankenstein and the Mummy sequels in the 1950s, in the 1960s they started to regurgitate Dracula films. And the Hammer horrors were quite particular, and a very famous, well, almost infamous now for the way that they were portrayed, which was very low budget, very low effects, and overly done scenes of blood, as in the blood was far too red to be real blood. It was like I don't know. It was like someone had melted down Optimus Prime and dribbled it as blood. And one of the things that came about with the Hammer horrors is they became much more violent and much more sexual. Now, of course, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, one of the things that, of course, we had in the 1960s in the UK and in America was the sexual revolution, where sex suddenly became the thing to do. Everybody had always been doing it, but now it was time to do it in public. And films caught on to this quite quickly. So firstly you had Dracula, and that was in 1958, and Hammer Horrors kept producing them. And they made a total of 9 films in 1958 to 1974. 7 of those portrayals of the vampire Dracula were done, of course, by the most infamous of all Draculas, Christopher Lee. How he did not get bored is absolutely beyond me. But they didn't stop with just Dracula. Film studios can never be accused of letting go of a good thing once they've got it and milking it till it's dead. So they continued on making low-budget, increasingly bad films, such as Bride of Dracula, which was a second Hammer Dracula film. Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Dracula has risen from the grave. I mean, who thought up the title, Dracula has risen from the grave? Well, duh, he's dead. But they carried on. And in the 60s and the 70s, they carried on. And we got absolutely inundated, as we'd seen with zombie films, and then with Frankenstein films, and with mummy films, we started getting inundated. And they would they did what the noughties did, where they stopped actually producing anything that was somewhat original and just kept regurgitating the same stories and the same lines and the same actors over and over and over again. However, it did give rise to something very interesting and very sexy. Lesbian vampires. Oh yes! In the 60s and the 70s, well, the 70s, we started seeing lesbian vampires. Because, of course, because sex was now so out in the open, and you could do it, not literally, without too much fear of reprisals, all of a sudden you could slam sex into a film. Whereas before, a film that had a kiss that lasted more than 5 seconds was erotic, all of a sudden we have boobs flashing everywhere. It was a great time to be alive if you're a horny teenager in the 70s. And we had such films as Vampire Lovers in 1970 and Lust for a Vampire. Lust for a Vampire is actually quite an erotic sequel to The Vampire Lovers. And it focuses an awful lot on gothic masturbation, epic love scenes, and it focuses very much on Camilla Kamstein, who was portrayed by a Danish model called Jytte Stungard, or something like that. I can't quite pronounce her name. And of course, you know what? It was full of boobs and teeth and fake blood, and it was classed as, I mean, to today's standards, these erotic films were very, very tame, very, very tame. But in the 1970s, they did something that horror films had stopped doing. They shot. Gone was the scare. Gone was the idea of terrifying people. Now it was shocking them. You know, I can't believe they've just done that on screen. And that is what we got going in the 1970s. We started seeing sex in horror films. The Hammer horrors were quite bad for it. I mean, the British, in many regards, really did wake up in the 60s sexual revolution. I mean, good Lord. You know, they really did wake up. And they put it in films. And the Americans did the same. And all of a sudden, you started seeing the classic mythos of a girl won't die until she's smashed her boobs. That's it. You know, she won't die until she's got her boobs out, or she's been in her underwear, or she's been in a lake and got soaking wet and crawled out in slow motion with the t-shirt clinging to her and the nipples sticking up like bullets. You know, she's not going to die until that point. And that's what we saw in the 70s. That's what, you know, it was now shocking. I mean, if you look at such, even going back to things like zombie films, you know, you of course had George A. Romero in the 1960s producing the first Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead, sorry. And in all fairness, the scariest thing in that film is the woman who plays Barbara's forehead. Dolphins have smaller foreheads than that woman. Seriously, all you see through the whole film, that forehead is shining like a beacon. The wise shepherds could have guided their sheep by it to the birth of Christ. It was that kind of a forehead. But there was no boobs in it, so it didn't quite count. So the 1970s, we didn't, and it wasn't so much sex as it was nudity and things that wouldn't be done. So you had lesbian sex. You know, it's things that, you know, you wouldn't see done. I mean, you wouldn't see. I mean, can you imagine Dara O'Hara? Who the hell is Dara O'Hara? Can you imagine people like okay, I know several starlets from the 1920s and 30s. Why can't I think of this? Imagine Rita Hayworth and was it Claire O'Hara? She was in Captain Blood. Claire O'Hara? Something O'Hara, I can't remember. Can you imagine Rita Hayworth and Miss O'Hara doing a lesbian scene together? It would have been hot, but you wouldn't see it done, because they wouldn't be allowed to show it. The 1970s removed all that. The advent of things like Hammer horrors removed the whole thing, and they started once again. Now, films up to this point hadn't done anything very groundbreaking. They'd started to follow a very, very stale trend. As in, they didn't do anything out there. They came up with the same shocks, the same scares, the same ideology. But in the 70s, it started to get very, very sexualized. And on that point, I'm going to leave this video because I've gone into the 70s when I didn't actually mean to. But so the next video is going to be on the 80s and the video nasties. And it's in the 80s that we really start to see another twist in the horror genre. So the 70s gave us sex horror. The 80s would give us gore horror. But that's for another night. Now, I would end this video with what I ended on the last video of Sleep Tight. But seeing as I've just been talking about boobies for the last 10 minutes, somehow I think you're going to be quite up. Toodles.